Well, a very warm welcome to Sally Field. I'm going to start with a couple of questions, mainly about the preparation for the film Lincoln, and a few questions about your career, and then we'll take a few from this audience as well. I read something that I found really interesting, that you and Daniel Day-Lewis prepared for the intimacy of the relationship that we see in this film by texting each other. And I found this so curious that I really wanted to ask you about that process.
Well, it's not really so odd. I don't know if that was really our way of preparing for the intimacy and the intensity that's in our relationship on the screen. But he was in Ireland when I actually knew that I was doing the role. It was about 8 months before we were to start shooting. He lived in Ireland, and I lived in Los Angeles. He doesn't email, so what were we to do? It was actually a very generous thing for him to start to do. And it was important for me to have a little bit of contact with him, because we shot this movie in relatively short time. We had absolutely no rehearsal, none whatsoever. And in some cases, we had absolutely no rehearsal on the scene on the day. Absolutely none. And he and I knew that we would have to hit the ground running. We were both doing a lot of research in our individual spots. We were across the globe. First of all, if he called, it would be horrifying for me. I don't like talking on the phone, and it would be awful. Phone, as far as I'm concerned, is like the stupid maker machine. I would just be a fool. And so it was, you had to really think about what you were writing. It was almost like writing letters. It really was. And that's how Mary, Molly, and her darling Mr. Lincoln, that's how they communicated with each other when they were apart. So it was perfect, and not really weird at all. And I don't think either of us thought it as any sort of preparation for what we were doing. It was just our way to, it was his way to keep some sort of contact with me, knowing that pretty soon we were in it together. And the only other time, I had very little contact with him other than that before we started.
Wow, that's kind of amazing,
but not much.
But I will believe you. And your character is introduced in the film in the mirror, listening to your husband recounting a dream. And it sort of establishes that Mary is the conduit for Abraham Lincoln's emotions. What he can't express, what he represses, you express. Was that something that you felt from the very beginning? Was that part of your approach to the character?
No, it just came out for me. First of all, Tony Kushner wrote the most exquisite text I probably will ever read. And I had done a lot of research by then. I knew what and who Mary was, from the outside of who she was to the inside of as much the pieces I could put together as to what her history was, and how I had linked it with my own self. It's what I do, because I really am method. I don't know about what anybody else is, but I was trained at the Actors Studio. So I never saw it clearly, because I couldn't stand outside of the character enough to make a judgment like that. All I knew is that Mary, what they said about Mary Lincoln is that she felt everything that she felt, she showed all over her face all the time. And what she said about Mr. Lincoln is that he showed the least what he felt the most. And so you put those two people together, and they are two sides of this incredible coin that became Abraham Lincoln. And had there not been a Mary Lincoln, there would not have been an Abraham Lincoln. And that's just a fact.
Yeah. And this time, because I watched it again tonight, having seen it 2 weeks ago, I noticed towards the latter part when he so poignantly says to you that the reason that it bothered him so much that Mary was wailing about the loss of their son Willie is that he couldn't, what he hated, he couldn't do himself.
Right.
That it was you who was doing that. And there is that sense of, how much they were the sort of yin and yang of each other.
Yes. Mary, had a problem sort of wrangling in her emotions. That's a definite fact. They would get away from her all the time. It's documented, some of the kind of horrific things that she did. It was documented that when they lived together for many years in Springfield, and he was a young lawyer, that they could hear her screaming at him down the block. But she was so emotional with everything she felt, and he expressed so little, so she would always be banging on him for, where are you? What's going on with you? Now, I guess that's nothing any of us can recognize out there, right? And so she didn't handle loss well. They both had a history of loss in their families as children. And they both had darkness in their selves. And I think it bonded them to each other early on in their young courtship. But when you see her in the mirror and she's listening to his nightmares, and he would come in and speak to her in the evening of his day and what he'd done, and he would always tell her about the nightmares that he had had the night before. He was tormented with bad, terrible nightmares. And she would tremble all over and be terrified that it was an omen of something. She was always terribly frightened that he was going to be assassinated. And she would shake and feel it absolutely from her toes to the top of her head. And then he would say, okay, good night, Molly. See, I'm going to go do some work now. And she would be left with it, holding it, because it wasn't I didn't have that in my head, but as I look at it, I know that's what it was. And you can see Mary's hand shaking as he talks. She was terrified.
Yeah. But even though I have read, as presumably many of you have, that there were questions about her mental stability, and towards the end of her life she was briefly placed in an asylum, but the film does not foreground any sense of Mary as mentally unstable. And I'm going to suggest that it may even have something to do with that wonderful disparity between your diminutive stature, like my own, and 6'2" Daniel Day-Lewis. What comes through is this poignancy almost of how feisty Mary Lincoln is in a situation where everything is so much larger than her, even physically. How did you and Daniel Day-Lewis work, despite the lack of rehearsal? For example, the scene where you end up going down onto the ground in a scene that undercut my expectations. I would have assumed that fighting him in that scene, you would try to get almost higher, and instead you go all the way down with the dress around you. I mean, just how did that scene work?
Let's see, how did that scene work? That scene was just an absolute aria in reality. And it was, a once-in-a-lifetime thing for an actor to get that kind of aria, truly. And when we shot the White House stuff, all of the deeply emotional stuff, sort of all glumped together, which we tried to stay very much in shooting in sequence. And we shot those in sequence, but nonetheless we shot them one after another, which was, whew. And we knew this scene was coming. We were all frightened of it. Stephen created an atmosphere, I think aided and abetted by Daniel, to work in that was so exquisite. I've never had it before. I will never have it again. In that I have always been a method actor, in that I create a cocoon for myself, it is a kind of self-hypnosis of a brief moments of insanity where you simply try to, as much as you can, to embody something that you're not fully and completely, because you've invited it on your exterior, you've invited your own life into it, and you live there in the accent, in the place, and you don't ever leave. And people come into your life, the crew, and they say, hey, did you have got a load of this Lindsay Lohan thing, man alive, and so you're kind of like, and trying to just keep that there. I'm here, and it eats into your energy. And so Daniel and Stephen created a place that I think the crew loved, because for the first time they were allowed to see and understand the actor's process. That is the actor's process. Actors hide it, or actors don't do it because they don't know how, but real actors who have learned how to do this kind of in-depth work stay there. You can't go in and out. You just don't go in and out. And when we came on the set, they were gone. Their work was done and they were quiet, and they would slip to the background. I never saw them. And it was this bubble of reality that there were 3 people in the scene, Daniel and Stephen and I. And Stephen never left the set. He never was at a monitor, some weird place. You didn't know where he was. He was there. He was at your feet. And when the scenes got really in depth, somebody would whisper something to me, and it would be Stephen, and would be like, where did he go? And this scene came after 2 days of intense work, 3 days of intense work. We knew this scene was coming. And Stephen said at the end of the scene, the day where we shot Willie's bedroom and some pretty intense stuff, and he said, well, let's just, we have a little time, let's just walk around for a second in Mary's boudoir and figure out sort of how we would shoot this. And Daniel and I, of course, knew the scene in our core by now, even though we'd never said it out loud. And I think we walked around, and we never said the words really. We just kind of mumbled them and didn't really say them. And the choreography that you see is what happened just between Daniel and I. I backed away. He rose up toward me. I went to the ground. I laid my head down. I rose up. He veered over me. He walked out of the room, and I stood up on my knees. And Stephen said, great, okay, so I'll just see you tomorrow morning. and that was the only time we'd ever sort of blocked it out. He said, fine. And next day we came to work, and it was a big scene. Some of the beginning of it was actually cut out because we didn't need it, but it went on longer. Oh, it was hard to say. And we got we were into the set. I mean, both of us, I could tell, like, fired and ready for whatever this was going to be. And Stephen said, well, we've got 2 cameras here. We decided we'd do 2 cameras today, which we don't do. It's the very wide shots you see, one from slightly behind Mary, one slightly to the edge of Mr. Lincoln. He said, why don't we just shoot it? We shot that scene, and we'd never rehearsed it. And, it's like we shot several of the scenes, we'd never rehearsed them. One of them was Willie's scene, and I said, please, I don't want to rehearse it, please just shoot it. And we did. And what you see is what it really was. He came in and picked something up, and it was almost a tableau. And we, of course, spent the day, ultimately, shooting the big scene. But it mostly he stays in the wide shots that we shot a few times, and then he comes in a little bit into covering, and we sort of finished kind of early, and the 3 of us sat on the couches going, did we do it? But not in that dialect. I was very much Mary. He was very much Mr. Lincoln, and Stephen was thinking, oh my God, did we get that? I went away not really knowing whether we'd gotten it. It was so emotional for me that I couldn't tell if I'd let everybody down. I sort of felt I'd let everybody down.
No.
And I think probably I felt that way because when Stephen, when Mr. Lincoln, i.e. Daniel, stood above me, i.e. Molly, and was so disappointed in her for letting him down, essentially is what he's saying. Only you can help me out of how hard this is. And she basically doesn't. She doesn't at that moment. Part of me, it was so hard, it took such a toll. And it took such a toll on me, and I think it must have taken such a toll on her. I think it must have taken a terrible toll.
Your comments are illustrating something that is often said about filmmaking, that 90% of a director's great work is casting. That once the director finds the perfect people to incarnate the characters, in this case, obviously, Daniel Day-Lewis and yourself. But I understand that at one point, it wasn't clear that you were going to play this part. In other words, I read that Spielberg approached you in 2005 to play Mary, but at that time, Liam Neeson had been envisaged as Lincoln. And then, when years later it was Daniel Day-Lewis, suddenly you were no longer definitely in. How did you fight to stay Mary?
Well, I knew in my gut from the time Stephen first asked me if I would be Mary in 2005 that it would not be that easy. A little voice said, "No, not so fast, Field, not so fast." And it was a work in progress. It was a long way from being a film. Writers came and went, and then Tony Kushner came on board, and he delivered the most beautiful piece of writing ever that I have read. And I went, ooh, wow, oh gosh. And then Liam Neeson dropped out for personal reasons, and Daniel came on board. And I think Stephen had always wanted Daniel, had asked Daniel time and time again, and Daniel, if he were here, would say he did all he could to stay out of the project, and finally he couldn't anymore. And when he came on board, I went, uh-oh. For some reasons that I instinctually knew, I think first of all, I'm 10 years older than Daniel, and Lincoln was 10 years older than Mary. I, by that time, was 20 years older than Mary. And even though Mary is a different era, I knew that in somewhere in Stephen's mind, it would not be unreasonable for him to be concerned about that. It would not be one bit unreasonable. And I also had it in my head that it wouldn't be unreasonable for him to want to have someone across from Daniel who didn't bring in so much baggage as I do, who didn't have so much history in film and television and everywhere as I do, and quite possibly might want to hire someone who was not known at all and could just come in and be that person without the audience ever having to adjust to who it was they were seeing. When you see someone that has a lot of baggage and is connected to other things in your head, it takes the audience a minute to go, oh, wait, oh, okay. And that moment is important. And it would not be unreasonable for Stephen to want to find that person. And a part of me that wanted to just hide and not face the humiliation or the loss, and wanted to just bury my head in the sand and go, I don't know, and fine, okay, it wasn't meant to be. And if I could just make myself not want these things, if I could just, go away and play dead. But something then said, no, you can't. You can't do that. This is yours. You've earned it. You've worked your whole life for it. Don't let it go. And I didn't. I called Stephen and said, and he said, oh God, Sal, I was just going to call you. And I said, I know, I knew it. He said, it's just I don't see you with Daniel. I saw you with Liam. I don't see you with Daniel. And he talked and said it was just not going to happen. It doesn't work. And I said, you're wrong, Stephen. You're wrong. I won't let you walk away. You're wrong. And I said, I am Mary. There is no one else. It is me. And he said, well, and I said, well, then test me. And he went, really? Well, Daniel is far away. He's in Ireland, and he just started this process that I can't possibly ask him. And I said, well, then just do it with me. And so he is an amazingly generous man. He did not believe in a million years I was right. And he tested me. It was Daniel and Janusz, the fabulous cinematographer, and I. And I did one of, it was an early draft of Tony's piece. I did the monologue that you see with with Tommy Lee Jones, with Congressman Stevens, whatever his name is, I forget all of a sudden.
Stevens.
You know, him, the bald guy. And I knew that day, and it was me acting by myself to a wall, which is never a good thing. But I could feel myself not take flight. You feel it when you catch the wind. You feel it. Something happens and you're not acting anymore. You're just soaring someplace. And I felt like a goose that was like skittering their feet on the water and couldn't quite tuck them under, and the wings never, and I just knew it. And so I thanked him, and the next day, and I was doing television at the time, and the next day he called and said, it's just not gonna work, Sal. It's not gonna work. I put you with some footage of Daniel and some recent footage, and I just can't see it. It's not gonna work. And I thanked him, and he felt so bad I thought he was gonna cry. And I said, Stephen, I just thank you for this opportunity. And I hung up the phone, and it was a good thing I didn't kill myself, because he called the next day, Stephen did. And he said that he walked around the lot and he couldn't quit thinking about it. He couldn't quit thinking about it. And then he talked to Daniel. I said, Daniel? He said, yeah, he'd sent the footage to Daniel. And I went, oh, sweet Jesus in heaven. Okay. And he said, but Daniel wants to meet you. I said, oh, okay. Good, well, I'm there. I'm just there wherever that is. I'll be there. Just you tell me, I'll be there. And he said, well, Daniel's in Ireland and we're here in California, so maybe we can meet in New York and have a cup of coffee or some tea or something. I said, absolutely. So I'm running around for the next few days trying to organize my schedule and blah, blah, blah. And then I get this call from Stephen's office saying, do you want the same hair and makeup people? And I said, for what, a cup of coffee? I was really going to be much simpler than that. I was just going to wear jeans and a t-shirt. I don't know. And they said, oh no, I guess no one called you. Well, see, Daniel's coming in. You guys are going to do a test together. I went, oh, well, good. So this is generous thing number 2. Generous man number 2 was Daniel Day-Lewis, who I think, neither one of them will tell me really what went on between the two of them, but I believe that he felt it was unfair for Stephen, who was protecting Daniel's early process, to not see the two of us on film together. So Daniel flew in from Ireland for the day into Los Angeles, and he and I met as Mr. Lincoln and Molly across a crowded sort of space from here to there. I was then Molly, and he was Mr. Lincoln, and I stood and he walked across to me, and I smirked at him and he smirked at me. He took my hand, I rose, he kissed it, and I said, Mr. Lincoln, and in my accent, and he said, Mother. And it was what they called each other. They either called each other, she always called him Mr. Lincoln, and he called her Molly or Mother. And we did some sort of bizarre hour-long improv. I don't remember what we said. And after that, I said, thank you, and you guys talk amongst yourselves. I'll always be grateful. And as I'm driving home, I got a call on my cell phone of Daniel and Stephen on the phone together saying, will you be our Molly?
Oh. Wow.
Yeah. And Stephen many times would say, Sal, I'm so sorry you had to do that. I'm so sorry I put you through that. But the thing was is that it had to be that. That had to happen that way because it was the way I needed to find Mary. It's the way we met Molly. It's the way we all met her. And it was this time that Daniel and I had together, this weird couple of hours where we were just linked together, I to him and he to me, in the most incredible fashion. First of all, because I was testing, and I was absolutely on him like a new suit. And he was equally so in my face. And it was why we didn't need to rehearse.
Now I'm going to go back to something you said. Your audition piece was actually the scene with Thaddeus Stevens, and the way that you bait him in the ballroom scene, because he's investigating Mary, the House of Ways and Means Committee for her spending in the White House. But I happen to have seen last week a film that you made with Tommy Lee Jones 21 years ago called Back Roads, directed by Martin Ritt, which, by the way, is extremely enjoyable, among other things, because one gets to see Sally Field as a luscious, sexy, colorful hooker.
What do you mean? I think Mary is very sexy.
Shall we say there is more disrobing in Back Roads? Here the only image is the corset being taken off of Mary, which for me is just a sigh of relief. But I'm curious whether your scene with Tommy Lee Jones, which I think is quite wonderful, and you know, Daniel Day-Lewis and you are not the only supreme performers in this film. Was that scene between the two of you informed at all by the fact that you had already baited each other on screen or squared off in that earlier film?
I think it was probably there somewhere because you bring in your own life as well. You just do, no matter what. Tommy and I, back in those days, did not have a lovely relationship. Tommy, if he were here, would say, even though he doesn't like to talk about anything at all, ever. But that he was, you know, he had some tumultuous years there, and that was right in the heart of him. And so I don't think he really liked being there. I got that impression. I don't know. Correct me if I'm wrong, but he was hard to be around, and so we were not exactly best friends in that. But subsequently, I would see him places, and he was so lovely. I mean, it was the only time that anyone who you acted with, who you worked with, who was sort of misbehaving, he came up to me and he said, "I think I owe you an apology." You know, like, well, yeah, and thank you. That was, and he's been so lovely, and he was lovely on this, as was his wife, and he just, it was wonderful to watch him work.
Yeah. It's the moment towards the end when the wig is removed is kind of striking because you suddenly become aware of him not as this very 1865 guy, but as a modern man. It suddenly takes the film almost into a certain present tense, and I love that moment too. In terms of the preparation, could you talk a little bit more? For example, did you balk at the fact, or did you suggest gaining 25 pounds to play Mary?
That's a good word for that. I bulked altogether. I bulked up. No, that was my idea. I knew that Mary was quite a bit rounder than I was. It's very much what Mary was, especially in these years. And Mr. Lincoln would tease her about her weight. It was she was vain. She had a very huge vein streak, and she was jealous, and it's part of I loved her for all of that. I loved her for her vanity, and she was terribly jealous of any woman who came near Mr. Lincoln, and as was I might add. But I knew that I had to put on that weight. I put on 25 pounds, which, being a certain age, is horrifying because you don't really want to be putting on 25 pounds. it took me about 6 months to do it, and I did it very healthy because I didn't want to drop dead halfway through the production, because then someone else would get the role. So I did it very disciplined, which I think I had to do, because otherwise it would have just felt like Sally being frivolous or something and eating all of this food. But I ate just revolting things that made me fat, and every night I would feel like a pate de foie gras goose. It just... And so it took me about 6 months to gain about 25 pounds. We had this goal in our heads, Joanna Johnston and I, who's the costume designer, who's brilliant, Every detail of this film, whether they be costume or Rick Carter in the sets, is absolutely 100% authentic. They had done so much research, they became historians themselves. You could be in Mary's boudoir and lift up a jar, and in it were real things that Mary was a chocolate freak. She liked chocolate, so there'd be things that would be what Mary would have, the books that Mary liked, the poetry that Mary liked. And she read a lot of poetry, and she read women's magazines and women's novels. I was a little surprised at that, but that's all right. Meaning sort of trashy novels. You know, the president was out of the room all the time. What are you going to do?
But she was also well educated. She spoke French, I had heard.
She was extremely well educated, especially for a woman of that era. She was extremely well educated. She spoke French fluently. She came from a very powerful political family in the South. It was in Lexington, Kentucky. At that time, was a very cutting-edge city. It was both very sort of influential in its own new way. It was a very new city, but they still had gunfights in the streets and things. And she was raised by slaves. So she came from money, and she was politically savvy. She was raised at a table where Henry Clay would be there, and he was the great compromiser. And she was her childhood sweetheart. I mean, he was a very much older man, but they weren't really sweethearts. She was a little girl, but he was endeared by her brain. And she got acceptance and love for the fact that she was smart. And that would be very rare for a young woman. And she came from a family that she was the fourth in line. Her mother died after giving birth to her seventh child. And her father married very quickly after about a year, which is very quick. And the woman that he married hated the other children that were from a former marriage, which meant Mary. And then she proceeded to have 9 children very, very quickly. So there was a huge amount of children. And Mary was lost. Mary was lost and had no one to love her except her mammy, the woman who had raised her, the black slave who had raised her, and her father. And the only way she could get the love from her father was to be smart. And to be politically smart. And she would sit at the table and she would wow everyone, all the men that were there, because she would talk to them about politics. So, when Mary spotted Lincoln early on in his political career, she said, "I will marry him and he will be president."
Wow.
And she set about to make that happen.
She knew she would be the first lady. I mean, that's extraordinary, but also if she was from a Southern family, were there doubts about her allegiance to the Union?
Oh, very much. Because she had siblings who fought on both sides. She had brothers who were in the Union and brothers who were in the Confederacy. And so she wasn't going to win either way, because they accused her of being a spy on one side, or the other side then accused her of being a traitor, that she'd betrayed the South, or the Union would say that she was bringing Southerners into the White House and they were spying. There wasn't any way that Mary could win. They hated her from the get-go anyway, because she just wouldn't go upstairs like the other wives had done and shut up.
That's why she's in history and they're not. One question, because we won't have time to go into everything, but you've also become a director yourself. You've talked a little about how Spielberg created this cocoon, about the way that he protected you and Daniel in your shooting. But you've also worked with some other major directors, with Martin Ritt a few times, including Norma Rae, with Robert Benton for Places in the Heart, with Robert Zemeckis for Forrest Gump. And I'm just wondering, which of these directors has been the most inspirational to you, not only as an actor, but as somebody who's directing as well occasionally? What is it about either Martin Ritt or Spielberg that gives you the chance to do the best work?
Well, I think I would have to, certainly Benton was is a wonderful, wonderful director and writer. And it's a different kind of experience what that was. But for me, Martin Ritt was incredibly important to me. He taught me so much as a human that I had not known. He was a very good friend and a mentor, and he was the first person in my career who said I was first rate, other than Lee Strasberg, and that was important too. And it was so hard for me to get some footing for myself that felt that I was worth regard. And but Spielberg is right up there. I don't know of anyone else other than Marty is a different kind of director, was a different kind of film, but Spielberg is a remarkable director and a master at what he does with film. But the gentleness and the love and support, the loving nature of how Steven works with his actors is astonishing. And what a kid he is, how much he loves it is infectious. He feels like he's just a kid with a great big gob of cotton candy, and he's just loving every mouthful, and he's got it all over his face, and he's just like, he just loves it, and it's infectious.
Wow. In terms, though, of your career, for example, when the AFI did its poll of the greatest heroes and villains of the entire history of cinema, Norma Rae is actually number 15 in terms of, the heroine. I'm curious, when you look back on your career, because you've done some amazing work even before this, is Norma Rae or Places in the Heart, for which perhaps you're best known, would those be your favorites? Or are there other roles you've played in films that are perhaps less respected that we should be aware of?
I really don't have favorites. I just don't look at it like that. I really try not to think back much at all. I think I spend so much time thinking, where am I next? And mostly feeling I've not done enough. How can I get better? How can I be more? How can I, that your reach should exceed your grasp, or what's a heaven for? I feel like there's something I can't quite get my hand on. And it makes it so I can't rest, and I never really feel that I've arrived. But I think it's because I came from a show business family. I grew up with a show business working class family. My stepfather was a stuntman / actor, and my mother was an actress that was, would one week would have a gig on Bonanza and then wouldn't work for 3 or 4 weeks, and then would have a part on Perry Mason. So I knew what that was like, and sometimes, I felt like, wow, we really must be successful here. Look at us, we've got all this, and he must surely be a big deal, because he acts like he's a big deal, and we've got things. And then they would come and take all the things. And then I go, wait a minute, wait. And so I'm a little child growing up in this. I'm 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And I realized that if you can never feel you've arrived, or something bad will happen. Wow. Something really bad will happen. Feeling entitled, feeling this is, it's the next step I'm owed. Give me the next step. No, the next step is harder than the step you just took. And the minute you feel that you're in some sort of glide state, that's bad. Something really, really bad's going to happen.
Wow. We only have time for a few questions because the hour is late. If you could raise the house lights just a little, we're going to take just a few, if I can see the hands, as now that my eyes are adjusting. There is one over there and one over here. And if you feel you have to leave, do it very, very quickly and quietly, but we're going to be leaving ourselves in a few minutes. Go ahead and I'll repeat the question. Shh.
Hi.
First, thank you so much for the fabulous performance. And you look 20 years younger than Daniel Day-Lewis anyway.
Thank you.
Thaddeus Stevens.
Thaddeus Stevens.
I wondered if you believe, given Mary's history of her manic depressive personality or episodes, was Lincoln's success also a tribute to Mary's political acumen, and was she always a part of his political?
Okay, it's a question, given the scene, for example, where you see Mary squaring off with Thaddeus Stevens, do you believe that part of Lincoln's success, despite the fact that Mary supposedly had manic depressive episodes, was in fact due to Mary's political acumen? In other words,
a couple of things. First of all, I don't know that Mary was bipolar. I know, no one was there to diagnose her, nor do I know that Lincoln was a depressive. I know that they both had episodes of great sorrow and darkness, and she did not handle loss and sorrow well. But I don't, even though her son put her in an institution at one point later on in her life, but that was because there was a rile and a thing about money, and he got pissed off and she got even more pissed off. And so he institutionalized her, but she was only there for a few weeks. She talked her way out of it. And, but she was just, after he was assassinated, I never really read a lot after he was assassinated because I didn't want to know. And someday I will go look, because I couldn't be there before I was there. And so as an actor, I couldn't know what happened after this. I didn't even read the assassination because I couldn't go, it was be in my way to know any more information than I needed to know. So, but I do know that Mary was extremely important in his success. He would not have been who he was without her. She picked him up when he was down. She had such absolute undying faith in his brilliance. And when he didn't have it, she had it for him. And she was such a passionate, driven person that when he would get melancholy, and he got it a lot, you can see in Daniel's performance, his melancholy rode on him. She was just like, I won't let you. You are, no one can touch the hem of your garment, because that's what she believed. And he needed that. He needed that. And she was so savvy. She early on taught him, she would pick on him all the time, that he'd used too much slang, and they told too many jokes, and they didn't dress right. And you can see it in the film, Mary wanted to wear the gloves. You have to look right. They're going to think you're a hick. You have to play the part. Halfway, he didn't listen to her, but then he always did. You see that he listens to her. Even after the big fight, he listens to her. And that's how it always was.
I have one more question. How did you lose the weight?
how did you lose the weight?
It was not easy. It took me about 6 months to gain it, about a year to lose it. And I worked out, I had 2 trainers, and I worked out so hard I had to have knee surgery. And it's just getting better. But I really, really, really worked out hard. I was really determined to get it off. But it wasn't fun, and I just wouldn't recommend it.
Question right here.
First, bravo, bravo, bravo.
First, bravo, bravo, bravo.
Thank you.
Apropos of what you said, where do you go from here? Is it perhaps the New York legitimate stage?
I don't know. I never know. I've been looking very hard because I would like to spend more time on the stage because it's so hard and because it's so deeply frightening. It's not facile. When things get facile, it's not good. But I would like that very much. So I am looking a lot for that.
Actually, in 2002, Sally Field made her Broadway debut in Edward Albee's The Goat,
Yes.
or Who is Sylvia? And then received rave reviews for playing Amanda in The Glass Menagerie. I think in Washington, was that?
Yeah,
So
Kennedy.
theater is obviously,
Yes.
it's starting to come more directly
Yes,
into your
yes,
life.
definitely.
So we would like to see more of that. Last question.
I remember you did Gidget and the Flying Nun.
Yes.
You worked with a wonderful actor by the name of Madeline Thornton-Shirley.
Yes.
I remember when you did Gidget and the Flying Nun, you
Yes.
worked with a wonderful actor named Roberta
No, Madeline Sherwood.
Madeline Sherwood.
Yes. 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 She was an actor studio actress. She was. Yes.
Yes, and she did wonderful work. And I understand that Daniel Day-Lewis is an actor studio or a method actor as well.
Is Daniel Day-Lewis an actor studio or
I don't
method
know
actor
that
as
he's
well?
not an actor. He's not from the actor studio.
Actor studio, but he's a method actor.
I don't know what really ascertains being a method actor. I know that the term method was actually coined from the group theater, the actor studio, and Lee Strasberg. But I don't know how you coin somebody being a method or not method. I mean, I studied with Lee for years and years and years. Daniel and I work almost identically. So I presume you would say, oh, well, then you must be method, even though he's not studied that specifically. But yes, I would say.
One of my questions would be, if someone has trained or has a combination of characteristics
Yeah.
of whatever is called the method, when do you learn that, and when do you find it? You didn't have it in Gidget.
The question is, if someone
When do
is
you-
working in terms of what we call the method acting, at what point do you find that? Because clearly you weren't necessarily working that way with Gidget, but
I met Madeline when I was doing The Flying Nun, and it was really not happy years for me because I didn't like doing The Flying Nun. Gidget was wonderful. I was 17, and I was just discovered, and so it was wonderful. But when I would do The Flying Nun in the day and go to the actor studio at night, and that's when I started to study. So, and it is just learning a process, learning how to work, learning a craft, and a kind of education I never had. The thing is that Daniel had a magnificent education. He comes from the English poet laureate as his father. He comes from a great literate and artistic background. I don't. My stepfather was a stuntman, a good one, but nonetheless. And I had no education. So my education of learning how to approach text and understand, things in a literate way, in a literate and literary way, really started at the actor studio in understanding this. So I worked with Lee for a long time, and it was the beginning of slowly evolving into understanding how to do my work. I think the first time I was ever really able to do the work that I'd learned how to do was in a piece called Sybil. And that, thank you. I think that was in the 70s, late 70s, yeah.
76.
So
where
it was a lot of
Joanne Woodward
understanding.
played your psychiatrist.
Yes, she did,
And she
yes.
certainly was from the actor
Actor
studio
studio,
world. And she herself had won an Oscar for Three Faces of Eve, which was a nice continuity with your
yes.
multiple personalities. I know that the hour is late. I just want to say one tiny thing at the end, because Willie, the son, died of typhus at the age of 11. And as it finally turned out, I understand that only one of the Lincoln children made it into adulthood, and that was Robert. So there's a kind of real sadness that hovers over this story for me, especially in terms of the character of Mary. But you have 3 sons, you have 4 grandchildren. And we haven't mentioned private life because we never do that here, but it just seemed to me necessary to mention at the end that I congratulate you both for the amazing lives that you have created, that you have played for us and brought to life over these years, and also for the lives that you have literally created and nurtured. You have, I think, managed to do a lot of good, not just in the film Lincoln, but otherwise. Thank you. Thank you for being with us.
so much. Thank you. Thank you.
Great to have you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.